So let's take a look at solving equations with fractions. For some reason, this is something that everyone seems to get stuck on. Just because it looks like a fraction, don't let it freak you out. Let's remember two simple things. Number one, if you can get rid of a fraction, do it. Okay, number two, if you're adding or subtracting, remember we need a common denominator. So in this case, we're not adding or subtracting fractions, so we want to do the first thing to actually get rid of the fraction or get rid of the denominator. So what I need to do is very simple. So I'm going to multiply this side by 7 and to cancel the 7 on this side. And I need to multiply this side by 4 to cancel the 4. But remember, whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So essentially what I'm going to be doing here is cross multiplying. I'm going to multiply this by 7 and this by 4. Okay. So I like to use brackets. This is especially important if the terms at the top have a negative number. That's a mistake that a lot of you made in the diagnostic test. So brackets I find can be very helpful because then when we're using our distributive rule, that can, oops, I'm so silly. Let's look at some questions that involve solving equations with fractions. For some reason, whenever people see fractions, they freak out. Don't. There's a couple of really simple things to remember when you are working with fractions. Okay, so if you're adding or subtracting fractions, remember common denominator. In this case, we're not adding or subtracting fractions, so what we want to do is, the second most important thing, is try and get rid of or cancel the denominator. So to cancel it from this side, I need to multiply by 7. To cancel from this side, I need to multiply by 4. But remember, what I do to one side, I must do to the other, which means essentially that that side's multiplied by 4 and that side's multiplied by 7. Okay, so I'm left with 4 outside of 2x plus 12. So what I like to do here is I always use brackets if I'm multiplying, two or more terms. This is especially important when there are negative numbers here because people always forget about it. So they'll make this one the negative, but they forget about this one. So I find that brackets can make that mistake happen less often. Now all I need to do is expand my brackets and solve as normal. So now it just looks like a simple one that we're really familiar with. So once again, the next step is we collect our like terms. I always try and cancel the smaller one. So I'm going to subtract 8x from both sides. So I'm left with 48 equals 13x plus 35. Still collecting my like terms to get x by itself. So now I'm going to subtract 35 from both sides. Okay, so now I'm left with 13 equals 13x. Finally, divide both sides by 13. And I'll write it up over here. Therefore, x equals 1. Let's take a look at this one now. As mentioned before, now we are adding fractions. So remember, we need a common denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this one by 3, multiply this one by 2. Now there are two ways that you can handle this. You can make this over 6 now and give it a common denominator. I'm going to do it a slightly different way that I think is a little bit easier. So I'm left with 3x over 6 plus 4x over 6 equals 7. Okay, now that I've got a common denominator, I can add these two together. So I'm left with 7x over 6 equals 7. A common mistake that people make is they try and cancel the 6 here. We are still adding fractions, so do not cancel it now. But now you can see it's just one of our basic two-step equations to solve. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 6 first of all. 7x equals 42. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 7. And I'm left with x equals 6.